You're tuning in to Measurement Made Easy. In this episode, we do something that most podcasts and video creators never do, and that is we are following up. In this episode, we bring back guests from a previous case study, Caitlin and Stacey of Grist Consulting in beautiful Australia. Their original problem was, how do we get people to complete surveys? And how do we design specific assessments that give really meaningful feedback that's personalized based on how somebody answers the questions? That was our challenge. So that was just about 4 to 6 weeks ago. We've got Stacey and Caitlin back, and they're gonna tell us how the original plan we came up with actually went. Let's get everybody on the same page and just a quick refresher of what was their challenge and what were the solutions that we came up with. Are you ready? Let's get started.
Very good. Well, again, thank you for being a part of what I'm calling an experiment now, because as our recorded conversations are taking place with you and with other organizations, we're learning so much about measurement and evaluation. We're learning so much about creating plans and what happens when we actually implement them and how those things change. And that's why I love this experiment and this project, is because we get to share with the world the reality of taking small, simple steps to measure and evaluate and improve our work. And just thank you for being on that journey with me.
It's good to be here to do this with you, Alaina. We appreciate the feedback and the push to get these sorts of things done as well in our business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it does feel like an experiment for sure.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. And I love that word too, because it's a little bit of a safer space. I think when we often conceptualize measuring, evaluating, calculating, it's like there's this kind of heavy officiality often associated with it. But when we look at it from like, it's research, it's an experiment, like we don't know exactly how it's going to unfold, and that's okay. I think that can take the pressure off of doing the measurement and evaluation work, and it makes us all feel a little bit more comfy. So
yeah, 100%. Yeah.
Very good. So to catch everybody up, because it's been a little while since we had you on, tell us, what was the challenge that we selected to tackle in this context here? What was it that you wanted to accomplish?
So we had just started putting together what we're calling our FFQ survey. It's a focus, frequency, quality, or we're also calling it our change readiness survey. It's a survey that goes out to leaders, predominantly frontline leaders or leaders of leaders, and we're talking about people leaders here that it would go to. And it was a way of doing a self-assessment that gives them some indication of the areas that they could improve if they're really looking at driving behavioural change with their teams and with their people. Now, we were looking at this as a self-assessment rather than a 360 or a 180, because we've found some barriers with doing those 360s and 180s in our clients, and we want to give them an alternative of how to do that as a self-assessment that's still really valuable for the participant to get some data out of it to see what they could actually do differently to drive behavioural change. So that's in a nutshell where we were at. And we left, do you want to recap, Alaina, on where the tasks we had from last time?
Yeah. If I look at my notes here, this is why I love the measurement prescription, is to see, okay, remember, best laid plans, and then life happens, and then some version of our original plan is what often is implemented. And that's great. And that's what we'll dive into in just a moment. But just to refresh everybody, here is what we said we were going to do and what we're going to talk about how it went. So basically, we wanted to tell a powerful story for the what's in it for me. And Caitlin, you're right on. You wanted to get at that. Why should people take this assessment tool in the first place? Because if they're not bought into it, there's not a high chance that they'll take the time to complete it, or that they'll take the time to complete it with integrity to get those insights. And so we were going to show evidence of clear impact in part of that story. We're going to describe the results that the survey was going to offer for people before they took it. And then we were going to offer them a personalized plan that would give them some clear action steps based upon the personalized data that was shared through that survey. And then we talked about the possibility of using a discrepancy evaluation model to basically give the individual or the team like a benchmark of here's where we're at, and where do we go from there? So the idea, not necessarily to use that model, but we wanted to give individuals and teams that benchmark of here's where we are compared to best practices or compared to where we were if we took this assessment a month ago or even a year ago, something like that. So does that all seem aligned from what you remember?
It is, and life does happen. I will pass over to you, Stacey, in a second. I think one of those, a crucial part for us, and you sort of hit the nail on the head, Alaina, when we're talking about experimentation, we were very conscious that to get some of those whys and some of those benchmarks, we needed to get out there and actually test it with a couple of groups. And that was probably where life got in the way, and we weren't able to test as much as we would have liked to. I think there are other things in there that as we got deeper into it, it's felt on the surface that it was a simple thing to do, and we got underneath it and went, oh, this actually requires a lot more thought. But I'll pass across to Stacey to answer that question as well.
How many of you like the idea of 180 or 360 degree feedback? Meaning that an individual, their supervisor, and maybe even a peer all complete a survey to get similar feedback. Well, in an ideal world, we'd all have the time, the resources, and the buy-in to do that when we want specific types of feedback, especially for teams. But in the real world, when things move so quickly and there are so many dynamics that are out of our control, oftentimes those 180 and 360 degree feedback assessments or surveys are just not feasible. So what do? Well, the best option is to do an individual feedback survey, meaning that we are able to ask questions and get feedback to an individual that could be just as good or maybe slightly less quality, but not too much different than a 360 or 180 degree feedback. That is the challenge that Caitlin and Stacey were coming up with. So not only was the challenge about not being able to do 180 and 360 degree feedback, but also wanting to make sure that we got people to complete the survey, we had their buy-in, and that we gave really meaningful feedback. So that was our challenge. And you got to hear what our solutions were. So how did it go? The question on everybody's mind, at least on mine. So tune into our very first learning, which was if we want to create a compelling why, meaning we want to get people a great story of why is this survey going to help them and what does that look like? Let's hear how it went for Caitlin and Stacey when they did the work to come up with that why.
I guess we did start with why, and we spent a lot of time thinking about the why for the people who are going to complete it, but also for the why to people who are going to make a decision whether they will let their own teams to participate in the survey. So those kind of gatekeepers. And really, when we were thinking about why, in our context, we often deal with leaders who do need to make sure that their teams start doing things differently or stop doing things that they used to be doing. And with that particular survey, we realized that the biggest why for people would be to help them identify which practices for them specifically will help them drive rapid behavior change within their teams. So that sort of tailors the message, showing that they will find something specific to them, but also that the outcome that they will achieve would be a fast behavior change. The other bigger part of while we were thinking about the why, we actually changed the way that we name what we are actually measuring. So before we were considering that there's 3 areas, focus, frequency, and quality, were like capabilities, competencies. But you find that in the organizations, there are a lot of people who do not like those words, and they feel like if they are measured on their competencies, that they are being judged. And we wanted to make sure that people don't feel judged at all, but they find something useful in it. So we named them as leadership practices. So this is something for you to help you to drive that change. It's not a judgment on your capability or whatever.
Oftentimes when we create surveys, we're really dialed in to what questions are we asking, and hopefully we're really, really dialed into the kind of results that we want to get. The one thing that we might overlook, and I know I'm guilty of this too, are the words that we choose to use. I hope that the first learning that you heard from Caitlin and Stacy about the difference between asking about the frequency of practices versus asking about competencies gives you an example of when we ask to get certain data from people, that we ask it in a way that doesn't make them feel judged. So next time that you're thinking about a survey, or the next time that you evaluate a survey that you've already done and are putting it back into practice, take a look at what are the words that you're using, what are even the metrics that you're collecting, and is there a better choice of words? Or is there better language to be using? Even better metrics, perhaps, like the differences between practices and the difference between competencies. So I hope that that's given you some great food for thought. On to our next learning. And this one is all about getting feedback.
Alaina, you mentioned before, one of the things that we wanted to make sure is to get people to answer honestly as well, because when you're self-reporting, it's really hard to get people to answer honestly. And this was another way of also addressing that component where we go, this is a really tricky thing. It also takes away that judgment, but also takes away what we're actually expecting from them. They're not really, as they're answering it, it might be that they need to do it more, they might need to do it less. We haven't really specified where the middle ground is until they have a look at those results. So it just helped us remove that barrier around honesty as well, that people would feel more comfortable to be honest about their answers, because it isn't about them, it's actually objectively about a practice.
Yeah. Go ahead, Stacey.
I know what I was going to add is that actually working on this, that was a very collaborative process, because we also involved some of our consultants. So we showed them the survey and we asked for their feedback. And one of the things that they were saying was exactly that leaders don't want to feel judged. And we were getting quite a lot of messages around this. So I thought that that would be a very important part to address, given like regardless of what we measure, we need to find the right way to name it so that people know how to treat it, really.
Yeah. And so if we go back to that first step in our plan for how are we going to get this team assessment together, but also how are we going to get it out there and get people to want to take it, that having a compelling why, I hear that a big piece of that was actually expectation setting. And I don't think we used that language when we originally talked about the plan. I was just looking back at my notes, and we said that we wanted to describe what the results were going to be for people. So kind of like, well, what's in it for me? But I hear that actually what you're doing is framing what to expect by not only in taking the assessment tool, but also the kind of feedback that you're going to get. So I think just even reframing how we shape the why is a big part of that, is expectation setting. So people know exactly what they're getting into versus just telling them what they're going to get out of it, but like not a little bit more around the expectations of what's involved in answering the questions to get to that honesty piece.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. I think setting expectations is one of those really tiny micro behaviors, we would call it, that is such a powerful one, because it makes such a difference depending on how you set those expectations up front. So I think you've totally nailed it there, Alaina.
Yeah, awesome. And the other thing I'm hearing, so as we're recording this conversation, I'm just sort of listening to what you probably would say were your greatest learnings in this experiment or in implementing this plan and building this assessment. But something else I think is worth sharing before we go a little bit deeper into other learnings is we were planning on testing this assessment with a client. And actually what I hear is that you did some pre-testing with your own contractors, or maybe even with people who are internal to the organization to get, it's almost like you were going to test the survey in terms of functionality and a few things, but you had to do some pre-tests to even be able to lead to the real test. And I love that you did it it sounds like it was an extra step, but also you did it in an accessible way by using the people who you had close contact with, where it was an easy ask to get the people in your immediate sphere to give you some immediate feedback. And I think that's worth calling out, that we might think we're going to pilot something with a client, a first client, or even a good friend that happens to be a client, someone we have trust with, but there may be it may be worth it to do some pre-testing with just some other people to see the things that we can't see. And so I love that that was an organic part of your learning and your process.
Time is a precious resource. We always have to ask ourselves the question, when is it going to be a good return on invested time by getting certain rounds of feedback? As you heard from Caitlin and Stacy, the work that we do is always iterative, especially around evaluation, or in this case, a team evaluation tool. So when do we know whether we should do a pilot of our pilot, as Caitlin and Stacy did? Or when is it simply important for us to ask our team members or some people from our target population to just take a quick look at our questions, or just to take a quick look at the why or the context that we wrote as we send the email with requesting that feedback?
The thing that we haven't yet talked about is the plan. So the idea was, part of the why is you're going to get a few personalized steps to take based on your answers to the questions. So I haven't yet heard how is that unfolded as you've developed this assessment tool?
Oh, that's really interesting because, of course, I had a grand idea in my mind in the kind of report that they might see that will just actually wow them. And then reality was, I realized that with what I was dealing with and the platform that I was working with, given that, again, the survey still in the testing phase was quite, like the platform was quite limited in the functionality. So I had to make do with whatever I had and lower down my expectations and just think what is it would be the most useful thing that people will receive. And as Caitlin knows, I have been sending her some feedback that I wanted to show the participants. And there was just a lot of text and I needed to reduce the amount of text and really get to the case specific things. And that's finally, I guess, at the end of yesterday, probably, that's what I've done. I just decided that the kind of feedback that we are going to provide them would be very straightforward. This is something that you're really good at. And these are the practices that you could be using more often. And there are only like 3 practices. That's it. If you want to learn more, here's a PDF to download with some more information. And this is the kind of style of feedback that we do want to test to see if first people just actually find the feedback useful, the instant feedback that they see, but also if they go and download the PDF later on, if that piques their interest and they're curious enough to do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think there was, again, going back to that minimal viable product, Alaina, I'm a big believer in creative constraints. And sometimes I think when we were looking at this originally, I think as Stacey said, we sort of had all these grand plans for this very fancy report. And then when we had those constraints put on us going, well, actually balancing up what a platform can do. And we did look at several platforms, but when really what we can get back to someone immediately versus if we had to take longer to get something back to them, what is the benefit? What is the return on investment for them? And we decided that getting immediate feedback once they'd filled it in was more important than us doing the really fancy report. And in that way, it really honed our thinking in being really specific about what sort of feedback we wanted to give them. As Stacey was saying, that really single piece of information that was the most important thing, most impactful thing we could give them in the moment, and then how we could disseminate more information differently. So, as Stacey said, we've got a lot of testing still to do, but I liked that those constraints actually made us think about how we were giving feedback differently.
I hope you found that these 3 key learnings from Caitlin and Stacy were incredibly helpful. Just to quickly summarize. 1, be careful with the words that you choose. We often use things in the learning and development world like skills and competencies. And maybe what we need to do is think about more neutral language to use, such as practices or the frequency of certain types of activities that really is about the activity and not about the person. So I hope that as you continue working, whether it's a learning and development initiative or a measurement and evaluation challenge or solution, that you think about the words that we're using and getting them down to that micro level behavior, or that micro level practice, a more neutral and objective space, just to avoid that sense of judgment. The second thing, taking the time to decide Do I need to get feedback on my quiz, my exam, my open-ended feedback questions, or my survey, such that I can make sure that how the questions are written and the language that I'm using actually resonates with either my team or my target population? Oftentimes we can save ourselves a lot of time of revising and redoing by just getting a preliminary round of feedback on the front end. So hopefully you have a wholly different perspective about feedback as a result of this conversation. And the third and final learning, which is the kind of feedback that we give. We want to make sure that when someone is taking the time to give their data, to share their perspective and experience in the form of a survey, that we give them something back in return. And we want to make sure that that is meaningful. How much information is just the right amount of information? That is the question of the hour. If you think about the information that we give like a domino, that we want it to have a longer term effect as somebody is on their long-term learning journey, what's the first bit of information or that first recommendation? Less information given at the right time is the best thing that we can do. Less is usually always more. And going back to lesson number 2, get a little bit of feedback on that from either your peers or a sample of your target audience, and I'm sure that will go a long way. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Measurement Made Easy. If you would like to stay in touch with Caitlin and Stacy, here is a few details about how you can do that.
Well, you've done so much to move forward, and I'm just glad that I got to be a partner with you to hold you accountable to put this assessment out into the world, because I know how much of a benefit it will actually be when it's on your website and people can take it to get to know you as a marketing asset. It's also a great asset to bake into trainings that you do with clients. So I think there'll be lots of wonderful use cases for the assessment as you continue iterating. So I'm just so happy to have been on the journey with you. And as we wrap up with final thoughts, perhaps we'll have you back for a third conversation when you actually do this with a client. But until then, Caitlin and Stacy, how can our viewing audience stay in touch with you? What do you recommend that they do? Where should they go to follow Grist Consulting?
Well, absolutely. Our website has got a ton of information, which is just gristconsulting.com.au. But we're also on LinkedIn. We're pretty active on LinkedIn. So you can follow the Grist page on LinkedIn with a logo with a little green stripe, or do follow Stacey or myself. We love to connect on LinkedIn, which is how we met you, Alaina, through LinkedIn. So we are pretty active in that space too.
I hope you'll join us either next week on demand or tune in live to get more personalized coaching on some of these actionable steps to make measurement and evaluation easier. Until next time.